Welcome back. You know, it's been a few years since I spoke about the Ruger Mini-14. The reason why I haven't spoken about it is because I haven't owned one for a few years. I went and sold it. Well, regrets being what they are, I regretted soon after that I had sold that fine rifle. It was a lot of fun. It was quite accurate, and I recently decided I was going to pick up another just like it. Here it is. It's a 580 series Mini-14. To be precise, it's a 584 series, which has a few. It has one notable difference, that the receiver is drilled and tapped to receive a Picatinny rail, which they supply with this rifle. Other than that, it's from what I can see, it's the same rifle as I had before. Obviously, it's newer. I have not glass bedded it. I will perhaps endeavor to show you how I have improved the trigger on this and made it basically into a national match grade trigger. This is a fantastic rifle for performing that. It's one of the finest triggers on the market once it's properly configured. Not hard to do at all, and with no expense. So, when Bill Ruger introduced this gun in 1974 and named it the Mini-14, how faithful was he to the original namesake, the M-14? Well, we have the advantage here of being able to show you a comparison between the two. I have a M1A, which is essentially a carbon copy of the military M14 without the selective fire switch. So let's go over to the bench and examine just how closely he followed that original design and whether he actually intended to follow that design, because there are some differences. So let's check them out. As you can see, the design similarities are quite obvious. I mean, just the overall appearance of the receiver and the conformation of the trigger guard and magazine housing. They're all very much along the same lines. The handle of the operating rod, the configuration of the slide upon which it moves, the top of the receiver, everything is extremely similar, but they're not the same. Now we have to get into Bill Ruger's head a little bit and understand where he was coming from. I had the great pleasure and honor of meeting Mr. Ruger when I attended the Armorers School at Newport, New Hampshire, and I met him at the Pine Tree Diner, which was a property that abutted the Pine Tree Castings. Now, Pine Tree Castings is actually the front door to the Ruger manufacturing facility in Newport, New Hampshire. Now, Mr. Ruger was a designer of guns in his own right. He could stand on his own 2 feet when it came to designing guns. He wasn't ashamed to borrow and be inspired by other gun manufacturers and other gun designs, but neither was he constrained to their original designs. And very frequently, he used the best that he could from the previous design and then carried them further into his own designs, which he felt were important to maintain what was good and bring something else that was maybe even better or more suitable for the public for which he was producing. Now let's start out with the receiver. We're going to move to the other aspects of the gun, but I think the receiver is probably the closest That's the first thing that we need to look at. Starting with the actual M-14 design, and this is, as I say, is the M1A produced by Springfield Armory in Illinois. But starting with that original receiver design, we can see that he was very faithful to the original conformation. Very, very similar in all regards. He used the same essential receiver shape. It's a little bit different in proportion, but he used the same essential receiver shape. And remember now, we're scaling down from a cartridge which is the 7.62 NATO, the 308 size cartridge, down to a much smaller, more diminutive size cartridge. It doesn't need the mass of the original M14. Now, the sights are certainly different. The sights on the M14 were designed for as battle sights to be immediately changed in the field by a soldier or a Marine to suit himself to windage changes, physical wind changes, so he could move his sights by simply turning a knob. Mr. Ruger was designing a rifle which was essentially for field use. He knew that the average hunter was not going around changing his sights, that he tended to work off of fixed sights. That was the tradition of most hunters, and I think that still is true today. Unless you're a competitive shooter, you go afield with the sights set the way they are. You set them up for the ammo that you're using, and you lock them in place, and that's the end of it. So that's essentially where he began and ended. Now, his version was the original series that had a little bit more complex and more adjustable sight than this, which was, since his time, reduced to being a more fixed sight. Adjustable, but not so easily adjustable. It was designed to be fixed in place, basically nailed shut, and that was it. But his design incorporated the peep sight. The peep sight was retained. The protective wings on both sides of the peep sight were retained for very functional and protective purposes. But he also understood that most hunters needed to have a little bit wider aperture for hunting so that they could hunt in all lighting conditions. So he opened up the aperture by 20 thousandths of an inch over the standard. This peep sight here is about 20 thousandths smaller than this one here. So he considered this is more of a ghost ring. It's not exactly a ghost ring sight, but at 0.070, this is a slightly larger and more usable sight for the average person under dim field conditions. So that means that he did not need to have a separate and expensive sighting arrangement, which would have raised the cost of a gun unnecessarily for a person who really didn't have any intention or need of changing it in the field. Now, let's go on to the next second obvious difference. This here has a little convenience here for the soldier in the field where he can put his ammo clip, stripper clip, into this slot, and he can feed rounds directly into the top, as he would have done with a 1903 Springfield and a Garand, whatever number of guns came before it. That was traditional. The military put those on there knowing that a soldier in the field could simply take a stripper clip and jam rounds down inside the box magazine. I'm sure that he didn't feel that that was something that was necessary for the hunter. He designed this gun in 1974. He released it in 1974. He was designing it before that. But in that particular time frame, we're talking about a gun which was largely a sporting piece. There was no connotation whatsoever that this was something that was going to be used in any defensive fashion or whatever. And for those rifles that were made for that purpose, which was the AC-556, the selective fire version of the Mini-14, you know, other things were incorporated into the gun, which made it a little bit more like the military version. So we're going to stick with the Mini-14. You can see this Garand-style rotating bolt with the operating handle is every bit the same function as this M-14 style Garand-inspired bolt. Virtually identical. There's hardly a difference to be found between the two. So that's where the receiver is so very similar. When you tip the rifles upside down, it retains most of the same similarities. You'll see here that the trigger guard is the securing device which holds the trigger and the the receiver in the stock. When you pull this, we'll do that. When you pull this trigger guard down, just as you do with the Mini-14, it releases the trigger guard from the housing. And in the same fashion, it's got a hole in the back here which you use to pry it open, and the same with this one. So exactly the same. Here we have the magazine release and the magazine retention function, which is exactly the same. It's placed in first at a forward angle and is rotated to the back and locked into place. And as it is with the Mini-14, absolutely no difference whatsoever. The conformation of the receiver is very, very similar, and releasing them is exactly the same. Now, if you had a wood-stocked version of the Mini-14, you would also have a stock reinforcement exactly the same as this one. In other words, this metal steel stock reinforcement would be the same found on the wooden version, the wood-stocked version. So there you have it. That's where the similarities are so very, very much the same. Now we'll move to the back of the gun, to the stocks. Well, again, we're not talking about the original version, which had the wood stock. The original version had a somewhat curved butt plate, much the same as the that he used on the 1022 and on the Ruger 44 carbine. This one here has a butt plate that has this plate that folds up. The only reason that existed, and the only reason the military put that on, was to facilitate full automatic fire, so that it would help control the full automatic fire function for the person in the field. Obviously, that was not something that was necessary on the Mini-14, and it was not incorporated. And likewise, some versions of the current M1A and other variations don't have that either. So, but the stock configuration, the drop-in comb, all those things are very, very similar. The lines are remarkably similar. All right, let's move forward. What about the operating handle? Well, Bill Ruger was very much aware that this exposed operating handle, while it didn't necessarily cause issues with most people, this exposed operating handle had a propensity to snag things, and it could be clothing, it could be somebody's skin or whatever it is. It could pinch you. So, you know, or it could interrupt your firing. So he enclosed that with this guard here on the upper handguard. And he also ventilated it. Now, I'll explain a little bit more about that and why he ventilated his and why the M-14 was not ventilated. That's a very important consideration. Now we're moving forward to, and the position of the sling swivels is obviously different. The sling swivels are mounted on the M-14 back on the stock, but if you notice, they fall in virtually the same identical location. In other words, the same distance from the rear sling swivel. So he maintained that same dimension, but without necessarily needing to have this extended forend. Now, let's move on to the barrel. Now his barrel, the original series, the 180 series, was a much thinner barrel than what you have on the 580 series. Okay, I'll get out my trusty calipers, and the M14 barrel measures 0.5, let's see, 0.598. I guess you could call it nominally 0.960. It measures 0.960 there. Measuring the Mini, imagine that, it's actually heavier. So this one here measures 0.625626. It's a heavier barrel out front. Now his barrel was certainly not as heavy as that. It was a thinner barrel, and I don't have an original series Mini-14 to measure, but it would be more along the lines of a, more on the lines of a slightly thinner version of the M14. So the 580 series has been increased in size. Also, the size of the barrel inside the handguard and the stock was increased. So let's take here we have this extra extension out here, and this is your gas piston in the M14. This is not present in the Mini-14 because there is no gas piston, and that's a very notable distinction, and I'll talk about that in a moment. This rifle here has a cutoff switch, which allows for one-shot firing. In other words, it shuts off the gas system. He had no reason to have such a cutoff system, so that was obviated. He did not include that, and there was no reason to expend money and to pay extra for a feature that most shooters would never use in the field or would have no interest in. Gas systems are entirely different. They are both gas-operated semi-automatic rifles. But as for the flash hider, obviously you can buy a flash hider version of the Mini-14 these days. When he first designed this as a ranch rifle, this was considered to be a sporting rifle, something that was used by, he called it a ranch rifle. It was something that was to be used by people to carry a field on their ranches, to keep their property secure and things of that sort. The original version, which he conceived, didn't have wings on the side of the sight, protective wings, because it was not a battle rifle, and he didn't see any particular need in that, so he had an exposed front sight. That has since been changed to have protective wings, just as the original M14 does. Slightly different in configuration. This is a larger front sight, and it's also got this ramp on the front, which some people complain that gathers light. I haven't found that to be true. But whereas the M14 front sight is smaller, it presents a smaller image from the top, but from the shooter's point of view, it's essentially the same. Now, it goes without saying that both rifles had the same forward trigger guard mounted safety, which was ambidextrous, which was a very, very handy feature for soldiers and Marines who were southpaws. They could operate with the same facility. And it also reminded them immediately in a battle situation, when they stuck their finger in there, they knew their safety was on. It was just a matter of pushing that safety off, and they were back in business. They didn't have to second guess about a safety elsewhere on the gun, which they might forget. So that was a very useful feature that Mr. Garand, John Garand, had devised and carried forward. It was carried forward with the M-14 and also with the Mini-14. So we'll snap that safety on. It can only be, with both rifles, it can only be put in the on position when the trigger is in the, I should say, when the hammer is in the cocked position. So we'll use our punch here and remove the trigger guard. They both remove in the same way. Now, what we have here are two triggers that are built on the John Garand pattern. They both insert and are positioned by the same track on the front of the trigger mechanism. There's this long track here that fits into a mating surface in the receiver. They both have safeties which engage in exactly the same way. They both have coil springs which operate which drive the hammer. This one here happens to be concealed in a tube, but it still has a coiled spring inside. They both have, you'll see right here, they both have a two-stage trigger. And the rear of this trigger is the secondary sear, just as you see on this trigger right here, has a secondary sear, and it has the primary sear right here, which connects with the hammer. And that primary sear is on both triggers directly part of, it's the same part as the trigger itself. So let's delve into that a little bit more. If I push the safety off on this one, you'll notice that the safety actually not only blocks the hammer, but it actually pulls the hammer down and positions it away from the trigger altogether. So it essentially immobilizes the trigger so that it can't do anything. So that's true with both systems. If I push this safety off, you'll notice that immediately popped forward. You can see how that released the sear. The sear is no longer even in contact with the hammer. And when I remove the safety, now it's in position to fire. So those are exactly the same. The configuration of the two is somewhat different. The original M-14 has a straddled type of hammer where the hammer sits astride the sear, and it basically like a fork. And for whatever reason, he saw no need for that particular extra machine work, so that hammer is not sitting across the sear, it's sitting underneath it. So it's a simpler design, you know, and when it comes to a production of firearms, simpler is better. You know, like I say, he was a designer in his own right. He was a firearms designer in his own right, who was the same person who in 1949 released the Ruger standard pistol, which is still, now it's in its fourth series. But that was quite a complex design that he thought up himself and put into production, which has been so highly successful throughout the last 75 72 years. So he was no dope. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew how to best configure things so that they were efficient. But in all regards, the function of both of these trigger guards and trigger mechanisms is identical. He provided a little bit longer surface here. Probably he reasoned that that was necessary to provide a little bit better stock protection for inserting a magazine. And all other things, the magazine release is configured in the same way. Very, 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 very similar in all regards. Another thing that he did to simplify matters, he liked to use coil springs. This here, you can see on the M-14, there is a flat spring. There is a flat spring that controls the trigger return, whereas on his design, the trigger return is controlled by this coil spring in here, which sits astride the trigger, and is also the secondary sear, which is on the back side, is controlled by a coil spring, which travels down, which is bored into a hole, which is in the top of the trigger. So it was a little bit simpler in all regards, and coil springs are far easier to manage when it comes to adjusting, because they can be easily changed in ductile strength and also in terms of length. Anything that can be done with a coil spring is much easier than a flat spring, which really you cannot modify a flat spring. So there we have it. Let's move forward to the gas function. And as you can see, you'll see that the interior of the stock is quite the same. This one here does not have the gas protection that you'll find on the Mini-14, and for very, very good reason, which I'll explain. Which is here. This liner is to protect the stock from the effects of hot gases. The M-14 has an enclosed piston. You can see the end of the piston right here. This silver, this right here, you can see inside. That silver is a piston which continues up inside this cylinder right here. And U.S. Ordnance devised a system where the gas flow would travel down into this cylinder and pop this piston back, much in the same fashion that the M1 carbine did in the US 30 M1 carbine. In other words, this piston here drives knocks the end of the operating rod back and drives it rearward. Now, and it also has a coil spring that returns the slide. The Mini-14 has the same coil spring that returns the slide, but the slide is considerably different. You'll notice that the slide is not simply an operating rod as you find in the M-14, and it doesn't have just a simple flat end on this rod. There are no gases that are emitted. There are very few gases that are emitted by the M-14 into the stock. The gases basically are bled out of this hole right here, which bleeds out any excess gases. This system, Bill Ruger was very intelligent when he recognized that this piston gets dirty and eventually starts to hang up and cause malfunctions. You have to keep that clean after so many shots, because eventually that's going to get saturated with carbon and fouling, and it will bring the gun to a stop, because that piston can only work when it's able to freely cycle back and forth. Bill Ruger, on the other hand, fashioned a system where this is a free and open gas port. This gas port, as you can see, is quite dirty. I have fired about, it's not many, I've only fired about 25 rounds from this rifle, but this is dirtier. And you might say, well, that's not as good. Well, it's much better in my mind, because you can shoot this until it becomes as dirty as can be, and it will continue to fire, because there's nothing here to plug up. This port, which is just an open hole, will continually keep on pushing this slide back without interruption. There's nothing to clog up. The only thing that's going to happen is eventually carbon will get very, very dirty around the inside of the stock. You'll never see it until you open up the gun. It can get as dirty as can be, and it's always going to run. You can shoot a Mini-14 many, many more times than you can shoot an M-14, simply because it's an open gas system that has it's self-cleaning. We're not concerned about the cleanliness of the inside of the stock. A shooter is concerned with the cleanliness of the action, which keeps it functioning. And that's where this system, I think, where Bill Ruger was far more brilliant when it came to his design. It's simpler, requires fewer parts, less machining involved, and it's just simply a gas opening in the barrel, which goes through a gas port. And that gas port, we'll talk about that sometime later, but that gas port feeds into this tube right here, which thrusts this bolt back. It's completely open with no interference in the back. So I think this rod is secured very simply by passing underneath a cross pin, which is in this bushing. As you can see, I was able to open that up and release it very, very simply. And it stays put. The M-14 system uses a little bit more complex method. There's a cross pin here that has to be negotiated, and that cross pin engages a hole, which is in this rod right here. It's more complicated. It didn't need to be that complicated, and Bill Ruger was smart enough to engineer around that and to come up with a better design. So as great as this rifle is, in many ways, Bill Ruger improved upon it. There's nothing wrong with improving things as time goes on. And you can see right here the lower half of this receiver, almost identical. It's got the same engagement points for the trigger guard as the M-14 does right here. The same underside. The bolt is identical. In all ways, he used everything that he could from the original design, but while incorporating and leaving himself open-minded to better the design. One difference that I didn't talk about was the bolt hold open feature. On the Mini-14, it's contained within this little hatch on the side here. It's a very simple lever internally which holds the bolt open when the magazine presses up against it internally on the last shot, after the last shot is fired, and it's also engaged by a button on the top here, on the top of the receiver. And in the original M-14 design, the essential function was the same. There's a lever on the side here which required more moving parts and a little bit more machining involved. Did exactly the same thing, and it didn't have this box on the side. So they perform exactly the same function, but in a different way. And in my mind, this is perhaps a little bit more classic looking, because that's what we're used to seeing when we look at the military M14. But Bill Ruger was function-minded, and he produced a system which was a little bit more intuitive and could be operated and dealt with in virtually the same way. So, as the French say, vive la différence. Two beautiful guns, two classic designs, and both should be appreciated for what they are. I particularly appreciate both of them. I love the M14. It's a very, very beautiful design, which is inspired by John Garand's M1. And just as the M14 was inspired by the Garand, the Mini-14 was inspired by the M14. And I think Bill Ruger did a fine job of taking the best of both and simplifying that which could be simplified, bettering that which could be bettered, which was, I believe, in the gas system. It's a simpler gas system. You know, the M14 gas system will operate, it's self-compensating, and so is Bill Ruger's self-compensating, simply because it doesn't make any difference what you run through this. It's all gonna throw gases back against the bolt. Let me make a quick mention about that. The Mini-14 is very, very frequently called overgassed by people. It throws brass a country mile. There's no question about that. It's also it's also noted that it's extremely reliable. The Mini-14 is not a gun which has ever been accused of being unreliable. Ruger has engineered that gas port to be the size that's necessary to function under all conditions, under all temperature conditions, and with any ammo that you put in it. Any ammo, 223 of any kind, and 5.56 military NATO of any kind. Any commercial grade ammunition or any government approved ammunition, this will fire without hesitation and without complaint. And it will do it year after year after year without destroying itself. So it's not overgassed in its own terms. It may throw brass a lot farther than people are used to, but it works, and that's the essential thing. In the past, I have tinkered with different orifices, different gas port orifices, and different sizes. And while they controlled the brass expulsion and ejection, they also created sometimes unreliability issues when it came to different types of ammo. So I've gone right back to having the brass thrown as far as it wants to go, knowing that I'll always have a rifle that shoots and functions perfectly. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Here's my buddy Benny. He came down to see. Yeah. Don't forget to subscribe. Push that bell so that you can be notified when I launch a new video. I'm going to have some more on this Mini-14. I'm going to show you how I have improved that two-stage trigger and turned it into a national match class 4.5-pound trigger pull. Thanks for watching. God bless.